Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere your high school history teacher absolutely did not cover. We're talking about 2C-B, the designer drug that somehow decided to be MDMA and LSD at the exact same time, like a pharmacological overachiever who couldn't just pick a lane. Not the war on drugs kind, not the just say no poster kind. I mean the real, actual, chemically synthesized, government Schedule 1, synthesized in a lab by a man named Shulgin kind. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a genuinely warm, heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are, and honestly, I love that your brain went there. Comments like yours are the entire reason this channel exists, and they keep me going more than you know. Leave a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It is somehow always 2 a.m. somewhere, and I respect that deeply. Oh, and if you prefer to fall asleep to this on your commute, in bed, or while pretending to fold laundry, we are now on Spotify. Link is in the description. Now, dim those lights, put a fan on for that soft white noise, pull your blanket up to your chin, and let's settle in. Because here's the thing, have you ever wondered what it actually feels like to be both melting with empathy and convinced your ceiling has developed a personality? Have you ever thought about how one man sitting in a California lab in the 1980s accidentally created the most controversial molecule of the 20th century? Did government agencies actually test this stuff on unsuspecting people? Were there therapists handing it out like multivitamins? How does something go from a psychiatrist's office to a Berlin nightclub to a DEA Schedule 1 controlled substance in under 2 decades? And perhaps most importantly, could you trust a drug that was literally named after a number? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up inside the story of 2C-B. The year is 1974. A chemist with a magnificent beard and absolutely zero regard for conventional career trajectories has just synthesized something new in his backyard laboratory in the hills of California. You have no idea what is about to happen. Nobody does. Good luck. Alexander Theodore Shulgin was not the kind of man you'd expect to accidentally reshape the landscape of modern consciousness. He was soft-spoken, methodical, and deeply committed to the kind of science that made other scientists quietly leave the room. Born in 1925 in Berkeley, California, Shulgin had a mind that didn't fit neatly inside academic institutions and an intellectual curiosity that seemed physically incapable of stopping at sensible boundaries. After a stint in the Navy, a chemistry degree from UC Berkeley, and a brief but highly profitable career at Dow Chemical, where he developed a profitable pesticide that bought him enough corporate goodwill to essentially do whatever he wanted next, Shulgin did what all truly dangerous intellectuals eventually do. He built a lab in his backyard and started experimenting on himself. Picture, if you will, a wooden outbuilding in the hills of Lafayette, California. Nothing dramatic from the outside, no flashing lights, no hazmat suits, no government signage. Just a structure that smelled permanently of chemical solvent and contained, at any given moment, several hundred novel compounds in various stages of synthesis, a battered notebook, and one man with reading glasses and the kind of focused calm you associate with either genius or the deeply unbothered. This was the farm, and the farm was quietly one of the most consequential scientific laboratories of the 20th century. A place that produced no weapons, cured no diseases, and received no federal funding, yet managed to generate more questions about human consciousness than most university departments with full budgets and proper ventilation. Shulgin had earned his freedom at Dow the hard way, which is to say, the profitable way. He developed a commercially successful pesticide for the company, and in gratitude his supervisors gave him a degree of scientific autonomy that was essentially unheard of in corporate chemistry. He used that autonomy to study mescaline, the psychoactive compound in peyote, and to ask the question that would define the rest of his career. If this molecule in this shape produces this effect on consciousness, what happens when you change the shape? What happens when you swap this atom for that one, lengthen this chain, add a methyl group here, a halogen there? What is the relationship between molecular geometry and subjective experience? This is, if you think about it, an extraordinary question. It's also a question that most academic institutions of the 1960s and 70s would not have funded, approved, or particularly welcomed. So Shulgin funded it himself, approved it himself, and ran it out of a backyard shed in Northern California with his wife Anne, and a rotating cast of trusted friends who agreed to serve as test subjects. This was science operating outside every conventional boundary. No IRB approval, no published protocol, no oversight body. And it produced results that conventional science is still catching up to 50 years later. You have to understand the peculiar combination of rigour and audacity that the farm represented. Shulgin kept meticulous notes. Every synthesis was documented. Every self-administered trial was carefully calibrated, beginning at doses so small they barely registered, and working upward in measured increments across separate sessions, sometimes weeks apart. He wasn't reckless. He was methodical in a way that would have impressed any institutional researcher, operating under conditions that would have horrified them. It's a bit like discovering that someone has been performing surgery in a very clean kitchen. The technique might be excellent. The location gives you pause. By the early 1970s, Shulgin had synthesized dozens of compounds, tested most of them on himself, and documented all of them. He had also, somewhere in that process, developed a philosophy that the human mind was the most important territory left to explore, and that chemistry was one of its most direct roads. He was not a hedonist. He was, in the most literal sense, a scientist who believed his research had genuine value for human understanding. Whether the world agreed with him was for the moment beside the point. He had work to do, and the notebook was open. Before he synthesized 2C-B, before the alphabetical soup of phenethylamines that would define his legacy, Alexander Shulgin had already developed a passionate and professionally complicated relationship with a molecule most people now associate with festival wristbands and very sincere declarations of friendship: MDMA. Shulgin didn't invent MDMA, that particular distinction belongs to Merck, who first synthesized it in 1912 as a throwaway intermediate compound, and then forgot about it entirely, the way you forget about leftovers in the back of the fridge. But Shulgin rediscovered it, refined the synthesis, tried it himself, and, crucially, introduced it to a psychotherapist named Leo Zeff, who would go on to distribute it to approximately 4,000 therapists and therapist-adjacent humans across the United States. Leo Zeff was already in his 70s when Shulgin introduced him to MDMA in 1977, and by several accounts the experience so moved him that he came out of retirement specifically to share it with colleagues. He spent the following years travelling across the country, introducing therapists to what he called the new drug with the old soul, training them in its therapeutic applications with a missionary zeal that was, depending on your perspective, either visionary or deeply alarming. He went by the alias Adam in these circles, which added a pleasingly biblical dimension to proceedings. This was the late 1970s and early 80s, and MDMA had not yet been made illegal. This is the part that tends to require a moment of adjustment. You're probably used to thinking of MDMA as a controlled substance with a very clear legal status and a very clear cultural association. But in this window, this strange, brief, bright window, it was sitting on a shelf in certain Dallas bars under the name Ecstasy, sold legally for $5 a dose, and simultaneously being administered in psychotherapy sessions to help married couples rediscover what they liked about each other. These two things were happening at the same time, in the same country, and no one seemed to find the contrast particularly jarring. What made MDMA so compelling to the therapeutic community was what users consistently described as a dissolution of psychological defensiveness, a temporary lifting of the armour most people spend their entire conscious lives maintaining. Under its effects, patients could approach difficult emotional material without the usual mechanisms of avoidance, rationalisation, and self-protection getting in the way. Trauma that had been walled off for decades became accessible. Conversations that had been impossible became not only possible but, remarkably, comfortable. Shulgin found this profoundly significant. Here was a molecule that seemed to facilitate the very thing that therapy was working toward: emotional openness, honest self-examination, connection, but was doing it pharmacologically, in a matter of hours rather than years. He was intrigued, but he was also, characteristically, already thinking about what else might be possible. If this molecule in this configuration produced these effects, what would a molecule in a slightly different configuration produce? This was the question that would eventually lead him to his 2C family, and ultimately to a compound he would describe as one of the most valuable and interesting of all of them. MDMA, for Shulgin, was less a destination than a signpost. It pointed toward a territory of emotionally mediated, psychologically transparent experience that he believed had enormous potential, and it made him want to explore that territory more systematically. He filed MDMA away in his notes as a benchmark, a reference point against which other compounds could be measured. Then he went back to the laboratory, picked up his pencil, and started drawing new molecules. The MDMA years were over. The 2C years were just beginning. If you've ever looked at the name 2C-B and thought it sounded less like a psychedelic compound and more like an obscure government form you'd have to file in triplicate, you're not alone, and also you are correct in sensing a certain bureaucratic flavour to it. The name is actually shorthand for a chemical structure, 4-bromo-2,5-dimethioxyphenethylamine, which tells you everything and nothing simultaneously, much like the drug itself. The 2C prefix in Shulgin's naming system referred to a family of compounds built on a specific phenethylamine backbone, essentially a 2-carbon chain attached to a benzene ring with methoxy groups at the 2 and 5 positions. The B at the end stands for bromine, a halogen element that, when attached to this particular molecular skeleton at the 4 position, produces a compound that is simultaneously a serotonin releaser, a dopamine nudger, and a full-spectrum psychedelic. Now, if you are lying in bed right now and chemistry class was a long time ago, do not worry. Here is all you actually need to understand. Shulgin took a basic molecular shape, the phenethylamine structure, which is, incidentally, also the backbone of adrenaline and dopamine, 2 chemicals your brain uses constantly, and which keep you, among other things, alive. And he started attaching different atoms and groups to it in different positions to see what happened. He was in effect doing the molecular equivalent of trying different spice combinations on the same dish, except the dish was human consciousness, and the spices were halogens and methoxy groups. The 2C family is one of the most coherent and well-documented series of compounds in psychedelic pharmacology, precisely because they were all systematically synthesized and characterized by the same researcher working from the same molecular template. Each compound differs from the others only in what sits at the 4 position of the benzene ring, and that single variation produces experiences that can range from mild and manageable to overwhelming and weeks-long in duration. This is a remarkable demonstration of how profoundly small changes in molecular structure can alter subjective experience, a fact that pharmacologists find fascinating and which should honestly give everyone a certain respectful pause about the relationship between chemistry and consciousness. 2C-B specifically, with bromine at the 4 position, landed in what many users and researchers have described as a pharmacological sweet spot. It was psychedelic enough to produce genuine alterations in perception and cognition, empathogenic enough to maintain warmth and emotional openness, and brief enough in duration to be manageable in a way that its longer-lasting counterparts were not. Whether this combination was intentional or fortunate depends on how much credit you give to systematic chemistry versus serendipity. Shulgin, characteristically, gave credit to the methodology. He first synthesized 2C-B in 1974, noted it in his lab notebooks with the careful precision that characterized all his work, tested it on himself at incrementally increasing doses over several sessions, and arrived at a judgment. This one was special. In a catalogue of over 200 compounds, that assessment meant something. Shulgin was not given to enthusiasm without basis. He had tested enough compounds that failed to be interesting, or were interesting in distinctly uncomfortable ways, to know the difference. 2C-B was different. It was, in his words, an extraordinarily versatile compound, one that could produce very different experiences depending on dose, setting, and the psychological state of the user, but that did so with a kind of legibility that he found unusually accessible. The name 2C-B is, admittedly, not evocative. It lacks the poetry of mescaline or the mystique of psilocybin. It sounds, as noted, like a tax form or a building code, but within it is encoded a precise molecular description, and that precision was the point. Shulgin named his compounds so that their structure was legible in the name, so that a chemist reading the label would know exactly what they were looking at. In a field where mystification was not in short supply, that clarity was itself a kind of statement. The thing you have to understand about Alexander Shulgin is that his method of drug testing was not what the FDA had in mind when they designed clinical trial protocols. There were no control groups, no double-blind conditions, no institutional review boards hovering anxiously in the background. There was Shulgin, a carefully calibrated dose, a notebook, and his wife Anne, who was by all accounts a remarkable woman with a remarkable tolerance for both chemical experimentation and her husband's hobby of ingesting novel psychoactive substances and writing about it at length. Shulgin followed what he called a staircase protocol, beginning with doses so small they would produce no effect in most humans, then incrementally increasing over separate sessions until a threshold of activity was identified. In the PICAL entry for 2C-B, Shulgin documented his trials with a compound, across multiple sessions and multiple doses. His early notes at very low doses, around 4 milligrams, recorded essentially nothing, a mild awareness, maybe, possibly placebo. He noted this without frustration. The way a careful scientist notes a negative result, it is still information. At 8 milligrams, something registered. A slight brightening of colour, a mild warmth. He described it as being aware that something is present, but not yet sure what it intends to do. This is, frankly, one of the more poetic descriptions of a pharmacological threshold ever written in a lab notebook. At 12 milligrams, the experience sharpened. Colours were clearly enhanced. Music, he noted, had become significantly more interesting, a characteristic effect he would come to see as a reliable marker of the 2C family compounds. His mood was elevated in a way that felt clean and transparent, without the muddiness or heaviness he associated with compounds that were primarily sedating. He felt, he wrote, as though the volume on sensory experience had been turned up by approximately 1/3. This is a useful description, and it captures something important. 2C-B at moderate doses doesn't fundamentally distort perception so much as amplify it. Colours are more colour, textures are more texture. The world is present in a way it normally isn't, because your usual perceptual filters have been partially lifted. At higher doses, 20 milligrams and above the RELD, the experience crossed into fully psychedelic territory. Visual distortions became pronounced. Patterns moved. Surfaces breathed. The emotional quality intensified from warmth into something more encompassing. A kind of transparent immersion in the present moment that Shulgin described as simultaneously personal and vast. At the highest doses he documented, around 30 milligrams, he noted the experience could become challenging, emotionally demanding, cognitively overwhelming, the kind of experience that required careful set and setting to navigate constructively. He was 60 years old when he was doing much of this work. Think about that for a moment. A 60-year-old man in a backyard laboratory in California, methodically working his way up the dose-response curve of a novel compound of his own design, making careful notes between experiences, comparing this effect to that one, categorizing, analyzing, and then starting over with the next compound. It was systematic in a way that most recreational drug use emphatically is not, and it was personal in a way that most clinical research emphatically is not. It occupied a unique and genuinely strange middle ground that had no institutional home and no real precedent. Anne Shulgin participated in these trials herself, and her reports appear alongside Alexander's in Pikal. Her perspective added a dimension his couldn't provide. A different nervous system, a different psychological starting point, a different relationship to the emotional material that the compound surfaced. Together, their accounts constitute something that is neither clinical data nor simple memoir, but something in between, a kind of phenomenological archive of psychedelic experience that remains, decades later, one of the most detailed records of its kind. Whether it is science is a question that depends very much on your definition of the word. Before 2C-B ever saw the inside of a nightclub or a festival tent, it spent a quiet and surprisingly respectable few years in the offices of psychotherapists. This is the part of the story that tends to catch people off guard. The image of a licensed counsellor, clipboard in hand, sitting across from a patient who is mildly hallucinating and feeling profound warmth toward the potted fern in the corner. But this was, briefly and genuinely, a real thing. Following in the footsteps of the MDMA-assisted therapy movement, a small network of therapists in the United States and Europe, introduced to Shulgin's compounds largely through Leo Zeff's underground distribution network, began experimenting with 2C-B as a therapeutic adjunct. The drug occupied what they considered a useful middle ground. It was empathogenic enough to lower emotional defenses and facilitate vulnerable conversation, but psychedelic enough to produce the kind of perspective-shifting insights that made it useful for patients dealing with trauma, repressed grief, or deeply entrenched psychological patterns. The typical session, as described in accounts that filtered through the informal network of therapists working in this space, looked nothing like the clinical trials you might imagine. There was no hospital setting, no fluorescent lighting, no clipboard with checkboxes. There was a comfortable room, usually someone's home office, or a dedicated therapeutic space designed to feel safe and personal. There were blankets, music, carefully selected, instrumental, unhurried, and a therapist trained not in the pharmacology of phenethylamines, but in the art of sitting with someone while they move through emotional territory they had previously been unable to access. The patient would take a measured dose, typically toward the lower end of the active range, and the therapist would be present throughout, not directing the experience, not interpreting it in real time, but available. The idea was not to conduct therapy while the person was altered, exactly, but to create a container of safety within which the person could do their own psychological work, guided by the compound's tendency to make previously defended emotional material available for examination. What emerged in sessions, according to the accounts that have been preserved, was often material that years of conventional talk therapy had failed to reach. Memories of childhood, ungrieved losses, patterns of behaviour whose origins had been previously opaque. This sounds, from the vantage point of conventional medicine, either visionary or deeply reckless depending on your prior commitments. It was, in fact, both. The potential for genuine therapeutic benefit was real and documented, if only informally. The potential for harm, in the absence of proper screening, proper dosing and proper training, was equally real, and the regulatory context in which all of this was happening was, to say the least, complicated. Before 1985, when MDMA was scheduled, these therapists were operating legally, if unconventionally. After scheduling, the legal status of their work became murky in ways that made documentation extremely difficult. What this means for the historical record is that most of what happened in those sessions was never formally written up. The accounts that survive are fragmentary, patient testimonials, therapist memoirs, oral histories collected by researchers interested in the psychedelic therapy tradition. They suggest a practice that was, at its best, genuinely transformative for the people involved. They also suggest a practice that was shaped by the underground conditions in which it operated, which created risks that more formal clinical oversight might have mitigated. Whether the net effect was positive or negative is a question the historical record cannot fully answer. What is certain is that the work was real. It was conducted by people who believed in it, and its premature foreclosure by scheduling left a gap in the therapeutic literature that has never been fully filled. In 1985, something changed. The Drug Enforcement Administration in the United States, having watched MDMA migrate from therapists' offices to Dallas nightclubs with growing alarm, moved to place it on Schedule 1, the most restrictive category of controlled substances, reserved for drugs deemed to have no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. This was controversial from the start. A number of psychiatrists and researchers argued publicly and passionately that MDMA had genuine therapeutic value and that scheduling it would cut off promising avenues of research. They were correct, as it turned out, but that's a story for another night. The immediate consequence that's relevant here is this. With MDMA suddenly illegal, its enthusiasts, both therapeutic and recreational, needed alternatives. The legal status of a compound has always had a peculiar relationship with its popularity. Sometimes prohibition reduces use. Sometimes, and this is the part that keeps public health officials awake at night, it simply redirects it. In the case of MDMA, scheduling did not eliminate demand, it shifted it. And among the small, interconnected community of therapists and researchers who'd been working with Shulgin's compounds for years, the shift created immediate practical urgency. Their primary tool was now illegal. What else was in the toolkit? 2C-B was in the toolkit. It had been there for over a decade, quietly accumulating a positive informal reputation within exactly the circles that were now scrambling to find MDMA alternatives. The therapists who had worked with it knew its profile reasonably well. Shorter duration, more visual, a somewhat different emotional character, warmer in some respects, more cognitively active in others, and importantly, still legal. The recreational community, which overlapped significantly with the therapeutic community in ways that would surprise precisely no one who knew anything about the 1980s, also took note. What followed was a gradual expansion of 2C-B's presence. Not explosive, not headline-generating, but steady and deliberate. The therapeutic network continued using it. The recreational network began discovering it. Word travelled along the informal channels that had always carried information about psychedelic compounds. Personal conversations, mimeographed newsletters, eventually the early internet. The compound that had been a footnote in the story of MDMA became, briefly and quietly, a leading character in its own story. This is one of the most consistent patterns in the history of drug policy. Prohibition of one compound tends to increase interest in related compounds, particularly when the related compounds remain legal, are pharmacologically similar, and are documented by the same sources that made the original compound well known. You ban the thing people want. They find the thing adjacent to the thing they want. This is not a complicated prediction. It was a pattern that drug policy observers noted explicitly and repeatedly in the 1980s, and it was ignored just as repeatedly by the agencies making scheduling decisions. Whether this constitutes irony or simply bureaucratic momentum is left as an exercise for the listener. The banning of MDMA was, in short, one of the most significant events in the early history of 2C-B, not because it affected the compound directly, but because it created the demand that propelled it into wider awareness. MDMA went underground. 2C-B stepped, briefly and blinking, into the light. In 1991, Alexander Shulgin and his wife Anne published a book. This in itself was not unusual. What was unusual was the book's content, which included the full synthesis instructions for over 200 psychoactive phenethylamine compounds, including 2C-B, written in accessible, reproducible, chemical language that any competent organic chemistry student could follow. The book was called PICAL, which stood for Phenethylamines I Have Known and Loved, and it was equal parts chemistry textbook, philosophical memoir, and love story between two people who'd spent decades exploring consciousness together. The first half was a fictional roman à clef about a chemist named Alexander and his wife. The second half was the synthesis instructions. The DEA, upon reviewing the published volume, later noted with some understatement that it was essentially a manual for the manufacture of controlled substances. Shulgin's response to this characterization was essentially, yes, that was rather the point. He believed the information should be publicly available. He believed secrecy served no one, that knowledge about these compounds, how to make them, what they did, how they compared to one another, belonged to the scientific commons rather than to any regulatory agency or pharmaceutical company. He also believed, perhaps naively, that making the information available would encourage responsible use rather than dangerous experimentation. Whether he was right is a question the evidence answers in conflicting directions. PICAL was published by Transform Press, a small imprint that Shulgin and Anne essentially created for the purpose, with the frank awareness that no mainstream publisher was going to touch a chemistry textbook for consciousness-expanding compounds. It was printed modestly, distributed through small channels, and sold quietly through chemistry bookshops and mail-order catalogues. It did not receive glowing reviews in the New York Times. It didn't make any bestseller lists. And yet, within the communities where it circulated, researchers, therapists, chemists, psychedelic enthusiasts, harm reduction workers, and a significant number of people who simply found it fascinating, it became one of the most referenced documents in the history of psychedelic pharmacology. For 2C-B specifically, PICAL was transformative. Before its publication, knowledge of the compound was essentially restricted to the informal network of people who had encountered it through Shulgin directly or through Leo Zeff's distribution channels. After publication, the synthesis was available to anyone with access to a chemistry library and an interest in phenethylamines. This is, again, either visionary or alarming depending on your prior commitments. What is empirically true is that the publication of PICAL was followed by a significant increase in the availability of 2C-B and related compounds, as underground chemists with the necessary skills began synthesizing them from the published instructions. Shulgin was not oblivious to this consequence. He addressed it directly in interviews and in subsequent writing, arguing that the compounds would be synthesized regardless, that information of this kind, once it existed, could not be suppressed indefinitely, and that public documentation at least created the possibility of informed use. He compared it to the publication of organic chemistry textbooks generally, the information in which could theoretically be used for harmful purposes, but which no serious person suggested should be classified. The comparison was not universally convincing, but it was not easily dismissed either. What remains 50 years after Pickel's contents were first assembled and 30 years after its publication is a document that occupies a genuinely unusual position in the scientific literature. Simultaneously, a rigorous chemical reference, a personal memoir, a philosophical manifesto, and a practical manual for territory that most institutions would prefer remained unexplored. It smells like solvent and reads like love letters. It is by any measure an extraordinary thing to have written. By the mid-1990s, 2C-B had begun its migration from therapists' offices and the farm in Lafayette into a rather different environment, the European rave scene. This was not a gentle transition. The rave scene of the 1990s was already a place of considerable chemical experimentation, built largely around MDMA, and the arrival of a new compound that was reportedly shorter in duration, more visually spectacular, and came with what users described as a more manageable and less physically demanding experience, was received with considerable enthusiasm. In Germany, the Netherlands and the United Kingdom, 2C-B began appearing in clubs under various street names: Nexus, Venus, Bromo, Spectrum, Erox, names that range from aspirational to vaguely pharmaceutical to frankly confusing. The rave scene of this period is worth pausing on for a moment, because its character shaped how 2C-B was used and understood by an entire generation. This was a scene built around a specific kind of communal euphoria, the experience of being in a large room with hundreds or thousands of strangers, under the influence of something that made you feel profoundly connected to all of them, moving to music that was designed to exploit precisely that feeling. MDMA was perfectly engineered for this context. It dissolved social anxiety, heightened sensory pleasure, and produced the specific quality of warm, uncritical openness that made dancing with strangers feel like a spiritual experience. 2C-B, introduced in this same context, produced something both similar and distinct. The empathogenic quality was present, but accompanied by a visual richness that MDMA lacked. Lights became more complex, visual patterns emerged in shadows and fabrics. Music acquired a spatial dimension that users described as being inside the sound rather than listening to it. This combination was appealing to a subset of rave culture that had grown accustomed to MDMA, but was looking for something with more perceptual depth, something that went further into the territory of genuine psychedelic experience while retaining the social warmth that made large events comfortable. The dosing, however, was a persistent problem. Rave culture in the 90s was not distinguished by its rigorous quality control. Pills and powders circulated through informal networks with no standardization of dose, no confirmation of content, and no particular mechanism for communicating the specific and important message that 2C-B at 25 milligrams was a categorically different experience from 2C-B at 15. The same pill might contain different amounts at different times. A person who had had a manageable experience at one event might have a deeply challenging one at the next, for reasons they couldn't identify and which were ultimately pharmaceutical rather than personal. Harm reduction organizations, DanceSafe in the United States, and analogous organizations in Europe began publishing information about 2C-B in their guides, noting the steep dose-response curve and advising extreme caution with unknown pills. This was, at the time, a genuinely novel form of public health intervention, organizations explicitly providing safety information about illegal drugs, premised on the recognition that abstinence-only messaging was not reaching the people who most needed harm reduction guidance. It was practical, it was evidence-based, and it was viewed with considerable suspicion by law enforcement agencies who saw it as facilitating rather than preventing drug use. The argument between these two positions has not been fully resolved. What the nightclub era produced in addition to a significant amount of difficult experiences and genuinely transcendent ones, was a body of informal knowledge about 2C-B's effects, risks and character that was broader and more widely distributed than anything the therapeutic community had generated. It was knowledge accumulated at significant human cost, in the absence of clinical infrastructure, and communicated through exactly the kinds of informal channels that formal research should have been using, but couldn't, because scheduling had shut the door. Of all the strange detours in the story of 2C-B, perhaps the most underappreciated is its brief, bizarre, and entirely real career as a legal over-the-counter product in South Africa. In the early 1990s, before international scheduling caught up with it, a South African company began marketing a 2C-B product under the brand name Erox, sold in sex shops and adult stores as an aphrodisiac and sexual enhancer. This was not entirely without basis. Users had long noted that at low doses, 2C-B produced heightened sensory awareness that translated, among other things, into enhanced tactile sensitivity and a relaxation of certain social inhibitions. Whether these effects constituted an aphrodisiac in the traditional sense is a matter of debate. What is not debatable is that a company successfully commercialized a phenethylamine psychedelic as a bedroom aid, sold it legally to the general public, and that this situation persisted for several years before the relevant authorities caught on and moved to stop it. The Erox episode is a genuinely remarkable piece of pharmacological history, and one that tends to produce a particular quality of stunned pause when people encounter it for the first time. Let's sit with the specifics for a moment. A compound that Alexander Shulgin had synthesized in his backyard in California, documented in meticulous lab notebooks, and shared with a small network of researchers and therapists. This compound was, in the early 1990s, being packaged in small bottles with tasteful labeling and sold in South African adult stores as a product for enhancing intimate experiences. The marketing was discreet. The product positioning was credible, given the compound's actual effects at low doses, and the legal window was sufficiently wide to make it, at least temporarily, entirely permitted. This is either very funny or deeply concerning depending on your relationship to pharmaceutical regulation, and honestly it is a little of both. The consumers purchasing Erox were not, for the most part, aware that they were buying a compound documented in a 2-volume chemistry manual as one of the most interesting psychedelic phenethylamines synthesized in the 20th century. They were, in most cases, buying what they understood to be a mild sexual enhancement product, not unlike any number of other supplements marketed for similar purposes. The gap between those two descriptions of the same product is itself a kind of pharmacological comedy. At low doses, the Erox marketing was not entirely dishonest. 2 to 5 milligrams of 2C-B does produce mild mood enhancement, heightened sensory sensitivity, and a relaxation of social anxiety, effects that are perfectly consistent with an improved experience of physical intimacy. The problem with marketing this as an aphrodisiac is that the dose-response curve does not flatten out at those low doses. It continues upward. A consumer who found the low-dose effect pleasant and decided to take more, a perfectly natural consumer behavior, would find themselves somewhere significantly further from the intended product experience. The instructions presumably did not include guidance on this point. South Africa eventually scheduled 2C-B following international conventions, and Erox disappeared from the shelves. It left behind nothing so concrete as a clinical record, nothing so useful as dosing guidelines, just the memory of a moment when a molecule crossed from the backyard laboratories of Northern California into the adult retail supply chain of a southern African country, packaged in a small bottle with a tasteful label and sold alongside things that actually did what they claimed to do. Somewhere in a South African storage unit, there is probably still an old box of Erox. History is strange. One of the most frequently cited characteristics of 2C-B among both researchers and users is its unusually steep dose-response curve, which is a technical way of saying that the difference between a pleasant experience and a genuinely overwhelming one is a surprisingly small number of milligrams. At around 10 to 15 milligrams, most people report mild sensory enhancement, heightened mood, a gentle perceptual shimmer. At 20 to 25 milligrams, the experience shifts dramatically. Full visual distortions, emotional intensity, and a degree of psychedelic depth that is considerably harder to navigate. At 30 milligrams and above, all accounts converge on the word intense, and not always in a comfortable direction. Let's put that in terms that make the stakes viscerally clear. You're not talking about a difference of 100 milligrams. You're not talking about a factor of 10. You're talking about the difference between 15 milligrams and 25 milligrams, 10 milligrams of material, which is roughly the weight of a single grain of salt times 10. In a world where 2C-B arrives as an unmarked pill or an eyeballed powder, the margin for error is vanishingly small, and the consequences of getting it wrong are immediate and impossible to walk back. You cannot unswallow 10 extra milligrams once the session has started. The train has left the station, and wherever it's going, you are going too. This is the thing that harm reduction guides have been trying to communicate about 2C-B for 30 years, with mixed success. It is not a compound where more is simply more. It's a compound where more is different, categorically, experientially, qualitatively different in ways that are not foreseeable from the lower end of the dose range. Someone who has had an enjoyable time at 15 milligrams and decides, at the next opportunity to take what they estimate to be a bit more, cannot extrapolate from the first experience to predict the second. These are, in meaningful pharmacological terms, not the same drug at different intensities. They are different experiences that happen to involve the same molecule. Shulgin documented this with characteristic precision in PiCal. His staircase protocol, the careful, methodical, session-by-session escalation of dose, was designed specifically to navigate exactly this kind of steep curve safely. You start low, you wait, you note everything. You come back weeks later and try a little more. This is not how most people use recreational drugs, because it requires patience, record-keeping, and a willingness to delay gratification that is not always in abundant supply. But it is the protocol that makes pharmacological sense, and its absence in most recreational use contexts is one of the primary reasons that a compound with a genuinely positive profile at appropriate doses has also generated a significant number of extremely difficult experiences. The dose sensitivity also creates a peculiar social dynamic in recreational settings. People share pills. People estimate doses by weight or by visual inspection of powder. People make decisions about how much to take based on what a friend said, or on vague recollections of a previous experience with a differently dosed preparation. All of these are ways of introducing variance into an equation where variance is the primary risk factor. It's a bit like adjusting the speed of a car by feel rather than by the speedometer, in a neighbourhood where the speed limit changes from 30 to 90 in the space of 10 feet. The car is perfectly capable of both speeds. The question is which one you're doing. Every account of 2C-B's effects faces the same fundamental problem. The experience is, by its nature, difficult to describe in language that maps onto sober reality. Users have attempted it anyway, with results that range from the poetic to the absurdist to the kind of sentence construction that only makes sense at 3 a.m. The most consistent thread across user reports is the word clean, a cleanness of perception, a clarity that sits in contrast to what many describe as the heavier, more demanding quality of LSD. Colours become saturated, Surfaces develop movement and texture. Patterns emerge in static backgrounds. Emotionally, the experience is typically warm and expansive, with a pronounced empathogenic quality similar to MDMA, a feeling of openness toward other people, a softening of the usual social armor, a heightened appreciation for music, texture, and human connection. Let's try to be specific, because vague gestures toward transcendence are the occupational hazard of this particular subject, and nobody learns anything from them. At a moderate dose, the visual effects of 2C-B are most accurately described not as hallucinations, in the clinical sense of perceiving things that are not there, but as augmentations of what is actually there. A wall does not become a waterfall. It becomes a wall with significantly more wall in it. Texture becomes prominent. Colour becomes deeper. Patterns in carpet or ceiling plaster acquire a subtle movement, as though the surface itself is very slowly breathing. This is different from the full visual productions associated with higher doses of LSD, and experienced users consistently note the distinction. 2C-B sees the world as it is, but more so. LSD frequently replaces the world with something else entirely. The emotional quality is equally specific and equally hard to convey in abstraction. The warmth users describe is not the sedated, slightly muffled warmth of alcohol or opioids. It is a wakeful, present, attentive warmth, an openness to other people and to one's own emotional content that coexist with full cognitive function and, at moderate doses, a quality of clarity that many users describe as the opposite of impairment. You're not less able to think. You are, if anything, thinking more transparently, able to observe your own thought processes with a kind of interested detachment that is normally unavailable. This is the quality that made it appealing to therapists. It appeared to lower the noise in the system without lowering the signal. Music deserves special mention because it appears in almost every account of 2C-B, at every dose level, in a way that is unusually prominent even by the standards of psychedelic substances. The compound appears to have a particular affinity for auditory processing, producing an enhancement of musical experience that users describe as transformative, not just louder or more pleasant, but structurally more available, as though the architecture of a piece of music has become visible in real time. Rhythms that normally blend into background awareness become foreground. Harmonic relationships acquire a spatial quality. A piece of music you have heard 100 times becomes, under these conditions, a different object entirely, familiar enough to be comfortable, changed enough to be revelatory. None of this translates well into language. This is not a failure of the writers involved. It is a property of the subject. The brain state that 2C-B produces is sufficiently different from ordinary waking consciousness that the language developed for ordinary waking consciousness cannot fully contain it. You are, in the end, back to the old comparison, trying to describe a colour to someone who has only ever seen grey. Duration is one of those pharmacological factors that sounds like a dry technical detail until it stops being a dry technical detail. LSD, for reference, runs approximately 8 to 12 hours, a commitment so substantial that early researchers described it as a full working day of altered consciousness, which is accurate and also somewhat horrifying, depending on how you feel about working days. MDMA typically runs 3 to 5 hours in its primary phase. 2C-B, by comparison, clocks in at 4 to 6 hours, which by psychedelic standards is considered relatively short, brisk, almost, like a meeting that ends when it said it would. This matters more than it might initially seem, for reasons both practical and psychological. Practically, 4 to 6 hours fits into the architecture of a life. It fits into an evening, a free Saturday afternoon, a therapeutic session with a defined endpoint. 12 hours does not fit neatly into most things. The awareness that an experience will be over in 4 hours rather than 12 creates a very different psychological relationship with that experience. Anxiety about duration, the recurring, destabilizing thought of how long this is going to last, is one of the most consistent features of difficult experiences with longer-acting psychedelics. With 2C-B, the duration is short enough that this particular anxiety is significantly reduced. For the therapeutic community, this was a significant practical advantage. A therapeutic session that begins at 10 in the morning and ends by early afternoon, with the patient fully returned to baseline by mid-afternoon and able to drive home and eat dinner normally. This is a session that can be incorporated into an existing clinical practice without completely restructuring it. A session with LSD that begins at 9 in the morning and ends, if everything goes smoothly, somewhere around 9 at night, is a full-day commitment that requires entirely different logistical infrastructure. The duration of 2C-B was not incidental to its therapeutic appeal. It was one of the primary reasons therapists found it practical to work with. The onset and offset are also notable. 2C-B comes on relatively quickly, typically within 45 minutes to an hour, with a rapid ascent to peak effects that some users find abrupt. This is different from psilocybin, which has a longer and more gradual onset that some find easier to prepare for psychologically. The rapid onset of 2C-B means the transition from normal consciousness to altered consciousness is faster, which can be disorienting if unexpected, but is also manageable with appropriate preparation. The offset is equally clean. Users generally describe a smooth, gradual return to baseline without the grinding, hours-long plateau that characterizes the tail end of an LSD experience. The come-down specifically receives unusually positive reviews by the standards of the compound's class. MDMA is well documented for producing a significant aftermath period, sometimes called the come-down or afterglow, characterized by fatigue, emotional flatness, and in frequent users, a noticeable depletion of the warmth and energy that defined the peak. 2C-B's come-down is generally described as gentle, a return to ordinary mood rather than a drop below it, sometimes accompanied by a pleasant afterglow of calm and clarity that users compare to the feeling after a productive meditation session. This is either a genuine pharmacological property of the compound or a reflection of the fact that 2C-B appears to have a lower ceiling on neurochemical depletion than MDMA. The exact mechanism is not fully characterized, but the experiential report is consistent. The legal window for 2C-B in the United States closed in 1995 when the DEA placed it on Schedule 1 under the Controlled Substances Act. This made it illegal to manufacture, distribute, or possess, with penalties that sat comfortably in the range of serious federal criminal charges. The decision was, in a technical regulatory sense, relatively straightforward. A novel psychoactive compound with no approved medical use and an emerging recreational profile was exactly the kind of thing the scheduling system was designed to capture. What made it notable was the speed with which the drug had travelled from Shulgin's backyard lab to federal prohibition in approximately 2 decades, and the degree to which the therapeutic community felt the loss. The scheduling process, it should be noted, does not require evidence of harm in order to proceed. Schedule 1 classification requires a finding that a substance has high abuse potential, no currently accepted medical use, and a lack of accepted safety even under medical supervision. These are findings that can be made on the basis of chemical structure, observed recreational use, and the absence of approved clinical research, not on the basis of demonstrated adverse outcomes in controlled studies. In the case of 2C-B, the recreational use profile was well established by the mid-90s. The absence of approved clinical research was guaranteed by the regulatory environment itself, and the high abuse potential classification followed from the first finding almost automatically. This circularity, A compound cannot develop an accepted medical use because the research required to establish one cannot be conducted without scheduling relief, and scheduling relief is not granted without an accepted medical use, was noted explicitly by researchers and advocates at the time, and has been noted regularly in the years since. It is one of the structural features of the Schedule 1 classification that critics have found most problematic, and it applies with particular force to psychedelic compounds, for which the informal therapeutic record was substantial, but the formal clinical record was essentially non-existent. For the therapists who had been working with 2C-B, scheduling was a clean end, not a gradual winding down, not a period of transition to alternative approaches, not a warning followed by an adjustment, a clean end. Practices that had been in development for years stopped overnight. The informal knowledge that had accumulated about appropriate dosing, screening criteria, therapeutic technique, and contraindications was largely not written down, because writing it down created documentary evidence of illegal activity. It exists now primarily in the memories of aging practitioners and in the oral histories that a small number of researchers have been collecting in recent years, trying to reconstruct a clinical tradition that was interrupted before it could document itself. The scheduling of 2C-B was, in the context of the broader war on drugs, a minor administrative action, a line added to the Federal Register, a compound added to a list. In the context of the specific history of this specific molecule, it was a door closing on a room that had been occupied for 20 years, and most of what was in that room was never properly catalogued. Alexander Shulgin had a complicated relationship with fame, and an even more complicated relationship with the consequences of his work. He was, by all accounts, a man who genuinely believed that the careful, responsible exploration of psychoactive compounds could contribute meaningfully to human self-understanding, and he was equally genuinely troubled by what happened when those compounds entered the recreational market and were used carelessly, at unknown doses, in settings far removed from the therapeutic context he considered essential. With 2C-B specifically, he had been frank and piquant about his affection for the compound, describing it as one of the most graceful of his syntheses, a drug that offered both depth and manageability in a combination he found rare. He also documented the experiences of what he called his research group, a circle of friends and colleagues who served as informal testers, including accounts that range from transcendent to harrowing. One trial account, recorded by a group member at a dose of 30 milligrams, describes an experience of such intensity that the person spent several hours unable to engage in conversation, moving through profound psychological material with a speed and force that was, in their words, like being accelerated through years of therapy in an afternoon. This was not presented as a straightforwardly positive account. Shulgin included it without editorial comment, letting the description speak for itself. He was documenting what the compound could do at high doses, not recommending it. His public statements over the years of his career consistently emphasized the same themes: context matters, dosage matters, psychological preparation matters, having a trusted person present matters. He was not naive about the risks of a compound with a steep dose-response curve and a psychedelic profile at higher doses. He was also, consistently, of the view that the risks were manageable under appropriate conditions, and that the appropriate conditions were precisely what recreational use most often lacked. This put him in a peculiar position. He was the man who made the compound and published its synthesis, which contributed directly to its recreational availability. He was also the man most consistently arguing that recreational use without proper preparation was a significant risk. He was simultaneously the source of the information that made widespread use possible, and one of the clearest voices warning about the conditions under which that use was dangerous. The contradiction was not lost on him, and he addressed it in interviews with a candour that was, depending on your perspective, either admirable or insufficient, In later life, after the DEA raid, after the revocation of his research license, after Pikal and its sequel Tikal had become reference texts for a generation of chemists and psychedelic enthusiasts, Shulgin continued to correspond, lecture, and be consulted as an expert witness in drug cases. He maintained to the end that his work had value. He also maintained that its value had been significantly reduced by the regulatory environment that forced it underground rather than into properly supported clinical research. Both of these things were true. They remain true. In 1994, a year before 2C-B was scheduled, the DEA raided Shulgin's laboratory in Lafayette. This was not, technically speaking, a surprise. The publication of Pikal 3 years earlier had drawn precisely the kind of federal attention one might reasonably predict from publishing detailed synthesis routes for over 200 psychoactive compounds. The DEA had licensed Shulgin to handle Schedule I substances for research purposes, and the raid was ostensibly about whether that license was being properly used. Agents spent several hours going through the farm, reviewing records and materials, and ultimately revoked Shulgin's Schedule I research license, which effectively ended his ability to legally synthesize most of the compounds he'd spent his career studying. Imagine, if you can, being the DEA agent assigned to review that laboratory. You arrive at a private property in the hills of Northern California. You're greeted, presumably, by a soft-spoken man in his late 60s who is unfazed by your arrival in a way that suggests either extraordinary equanimity or extraordinary confidence, possibly both. You're shown into the backyard laboratory, which contains hundreds of chemical compounds in carefully labelled containers, decades of meticulous research notebooks, and a periodic table on the wall. You have been briefed that the man who lives here has personally synthesized and self-administered over 200 novel psychoactive substances and published the results in a book you can buy in any chemistry bookshop. You're here to assess compliance with his research license. You take in the room, you make notes. The revocation of the license was, under the circumstances, relatively gentle. The DEA had significant latitude in how it could have responded to a man who had published what amounted to a synthesis manual for Schedule I substances while holding a DEA research license. No charges were filed, no prosecution followed. The license was revoked. Shulgin was, after 20 years, no longer permitted to legally handle the compounds he had created, and the agents departed. The farm remained. The notebooks remained. Shulgin himself remained, and continued writing, lecturing, and being consulted on drug chemistry for years afterward. The episode is often cited as an example of the ambiguity in the DEA's relationship with Shulgin, the sense that the agency found him simultaneously problematic and useful, too prominent to prosecute aggressively and too consequential to ignore. He had been an expert witness for the DEA in drug cases. He was also the author of the most widely distributed synthesis manual for controlled substances in history. These two things coexisted in an uncomfortable truce for years before the farm was raided, and the truce became, slightly, less comfortable. What the raid produced, more than any practical change in what Shulgin could do, was a clarification of position. The DEA was not going to prosecute him. It was also not going to pretend he was operating within the spirit of his research authorization. The revocation of the license was a statement. This arrangement has ended, and the terms under which you may conduct this work no longer exist. Shulgin received this with the equanimity he brought to most things, continued his work through legal means, and eventually died with his notebook still in the laboratory that had produced the most significant catalogue of psychedelic compounds in the history of chemistry. In the absence of formal clinical research, which the Schedule I classification had largely foreclosed, knowledge about 2C-B's effects, risks, and best practices accumulated in an informal and deeply unofficial parallel system. Organizations focused on drug harm reduction, particularly in the European rave context, began collecting and publishing user reports, dosage guidelines, and safety information aimed at people who are going to use the compound regardless of its legal status, and who therefore might benefit from accurate information. This was a philosophically contentious approach, providing practical guidance on illegal drug use, but the harm reduction argument was straightforwardly pragmatic. People were using the drug, accurate information reduced the chance of dangerous outcomes, and the alternative was uninformed use rather than no use. The most significant single repository for this information, particularly in the English-speaking world, was Erowid, a website founded in 1995 by a pair of researchers who believed that accurate, evidence-based information about psychoactive substances should be publicly available, and who responded to the absence of such information in official sources by building it themselves. The 2C-B section of Erowid's database became, over the following decades, one of the most detailed repositories of first-person psychedelic experience reports available anywhere. Thousands of submitted accounts, across a range of doses and contexts and combinations, created a picture of the compound's effects that no clinical study of comparable scale had produced, because no clinical study of comparable scale had been permitted to exist. The methodological limitations of this kind of data are real and acknowledged. Self-reported experience accounts are not controlled trials. Doses are estimated, not measured. Set and setting vary enormously. The population submitting reports is self-selected in ways that probably skew toward more experienced users with more positive relationships to psychedelic substances than the general population. None of this means the data is useless. It means the data is what it is. A large, varied, messy, genuinely informative picture of what happens when a significant number of human beings take a specific compound under various conditions and then write about it. In the absence of anything better, it was a resource. Harm reduction organizations also developed and distributed reagent testing kits, chemical tests that could be used to identify the presence of 2C-B in a pill or powder, and to distinguish it from more dangerous compounds that were sometimes sold under its name. The Marquis reagent, which produces a characteristic colour reaction with phenethylamine compounds, became a standard component of festival drug checking services. DanceSafe in the United States and equivalent organisations in Europe trained volunteers in the use of these kits and deployed them at major events, providing real-time information to people who'd already obtained a substance and were trying to determine whether it was what they thought it was. This was, again, a form of public health intervention that operated in a legal and ethical grey zone, premised on the practical reality of drug use at large events and the well-documented principle that people make safer decisions with accurate information than with none. Whether it was the right approach is a question the evidence cannot fully resolve. What the evidence does show is that drug checking services at festivals were associated with changes in intended use. People who found out their pill did not contain what they thought it contained often decided not to take it. Information, even in this context, influenced behaviour. No discussion of 2C-B's history would be complete without addressing the phenomenon of combination, the practice, common in recreational settings, of using 2C-B alongside other substances, most commonly MDMA. This combination, referred to in slang as a candy flip or a nexus flip depending on which decade and which continent you're on, was sufficiently widespread by the late 90s to have generated a substantial body of user reports and eventually genuine pharmacological concern. The concern is not arbitrary. Both MDMA and 2C-B act significantly on the serotonin system, and combining serotonergic compounds increases the risk of serotonin syndrome, a potentially dangerous condition involving overstimulation of serotonin receptors that can range from uncomfortable to medically serious. Let's be very clear about what serotonin syndrome involves, because the phrase floats around harm reduction literature with a frequency that occasionally obscures its seriousness. Mild serotonin syndrome produces agitation, muscle twitching, and elevated heart rate. Moderate cases add hypothermia, dangerous elevation of body temperature, along with more pronounced muscle rigidity and neurological symptoms. Severe cases are a medical emergency. The spectrum is wide, the early signs can be ambiguous, and the setting in which they most commonly present, a warm, crowded nightclub, several hours into a combination of serotonergic compounds, is one of the worst possible environments for identifying and responding to a medical complication. This is not a theoretical risk. It is a documented risk with a documented physiological mechanism. And yet the Nexus flip remained popular. The user reports that accumulated on Erowid and in harm reduction literature were, in aggregate, mixed. Accounts of intensely positive experiences sitting alongside accounts of experiences that were overwhelming, anxiety-inducing, and physically uncomfortable in ways that varied from unpleasant to alarming. The dose question, already complicated with 2C-B alone, becomes significantly more complicated when a second serotonergic compound is added. The interaction is not linear, and the combined effect at doses that would be manageable separately can be considerably more intense than either compound alone. There is something worth understanding about why combinations remained common despite these risks, and it is not simply that people ignored the warnings. It is that the positive accounts of the combination were sufficiently vivid and compelling that they created a demand that risk information competed with imperfectly. People who had had transcendent experiences with the combination were motivated to share those accounts. People who had had difficult experiences often were not. This asymmetry in reporting, a well-documented phenomenon in recreational drug use literature, meant that the informal knowledge base consistently underrepresented the negative tail of the distribution and overrepresented the positive peak. Harm reduction organizations spent years trying to correct for this asymmetry with limited success. The broader lesson here is about the relationship between individual positive experience and population risk, a distinction that is intuitive in some domains and consistently underweighted in others. Most people who take 2C-B and MDMA together do not develop serious serotonin syndrome. This true fact coexists with the other true fact that combining serotonergic compounds increases the risk of a potentially life-threatening complication in ways that are not predictable on an individual basis. These two things are not in contradiction. They simply require a form of probabilistic thinking about personal risk that most people, in most recreational settings, are not doing. 2C-B does not exist in isolation. It is one member of a large and chemically coherent family of compounds, the 2C-phenethylamines, all of which share the same basic molecular skeleton and differ only in what is attached at the 4 position of the benzene ring. Shulgin synthesized and tested dozens of them, and each one, depending on what was attached at that position, produced a distinct and sometimes startlingly different experience. 2C1 substitutes iodine for bromine and reportedly produces a longer and somewhat more cognitive experience. 2CE, with an ethyl group at 4, was described by Shulgin as more demanding and introspective than 2C-B, with a harder edge and a higher potential for psychological difficulty. 2CT7, which adds a sulfur-containing side chain, had a longer duration and attracted considerable recreational use in the early 2000s before being associated with a number of fatalities that led to widespread alarm in the harm reduction community. The family resemblance within the 2C series is both the most interesting thing about it pharmacologically and the most problematic thing about it in regulatory terms. Because the compounds share a molecular skeleton, someone with knowledge of 2C-B's synthesis can, with relatively modest modification, produce most of its relatives. This is the designer drug problem in its clearest form. Each new member of the family is technically a distinct compound with a distinct legal status, and the work of scheduling one does not automatically capture the others. The DAEA and analogous agencies in other countries spent much of the late 90s and early 2000s playing catch-up with the 2C family, scheduling individual compounds as they emerged in recreational markets, while Shulgin's Pickle sat on the shelf containing synthesis instructions for dozens of variants still waiting to be tested. Each member of the family has its own character, its own advocates, and its own horror stories. 2CE, which Shulgin described with more caution than most of his favourites, was associated with a small number of hospitalisation reports in the mid-2000s in cases where doses exceeded the threshold of manageable experience. 2C1, lighter and shorter than 2CB by most accounts, became a common adulterant in pills sold as 2CB, which created its own documentary record in drug-checking data. 2CD, one of the milder members of the family, was occasionally discussed as a potential microdosing candidate, with a profile gentle enough to be active at very low doses without producing the full psychedelic effects of its relatives. The 2C family is, in this sense, a pharmacological library assembled by one man over several decades, a systematic exploration of molecular space around a single template, producing data about the relationship between chemical structure and subjective experience that no conventional research program would have been permitted to generate. The data is messy, informal, and methodologically heterodox. It is also the most detailed record of its kind in existence. Shulgin understood that he was building a library. The question of who would be permitted to use it was, for him, always secondary to the question of whether it existed. One of the persistent frustrations of drug scheduling as a regulatory strategy is that it operates on specific named compounds, which means that as soon as a compound is scheduled, chemists can synthesize a structurally similar variant that falls outside the existing schedule. This cat-and-mouse dynamic was not lost on the United States Congress, which responded in 1986 with the Federal Analog Act, a provision of the Controlled Substances Act that extended Schedule I treatment to any compound that was substantially similar in structure or pharmacological effect to a scheduled substance, when intended for human consumption. In theory, this was designed to preemptively capture the designer drug problem. In practice, it created a body of genuinely complex and contested legal questions about what substantially similar meant in a chemical and pharmacological sense. The legal history of the Analog Act is, if you're interested in the intersection of chemistry and jurisprudence, genuinely fascinating. Courts across different federal circuits have applied different standards to the substantially similar question, producing inconsistent results that have made prosecution unpredictable and defense strategy complicated. Some courts have required expert testimony about pharmacological effect. Others have focused primarily on structural similarity. Some have found that similarity in chemical structure is sufficient to trigger Analog Act coverage. Others have required evidence of similar subjective effects. The result is a patchwork of precedent that makes the legal status of any specific unscheduled compound dependent as much on which federal district you happen to be prosecuted in as on any property of the compound itself. For the 2C family, the Analog Act created a grey zone that was, for a period in the late 90s and early 2000s, genuinely difficult to navigate. 2CB was scheduled in 1995. Its relatives, 2CI, 2CE, 2CD, 2CT7 and others, were not individually scheduled until later, and during the interval, their legal status was governed by the Analog Act, which meant it was governed by prosecutorial discretion and judicial interpretation. You could be prosecuted for possessing an unscheduled compound under the Analog Act or you might not be. The outcome depended on facts and circumstances that were not fully predictable in advance. This legal ambiguity had predictable effects on both the supply and demand sides of the market. Suppliers of 2C-B and related compounds moved between different family members as scheduling actions occurred, substituting unscheduled analogues for scheduled ones in ways that drug check-in services documented consistently. Users who thought they were purchasing one compound frequently received another, with different potency, different duration, and different risk profile. The Analog Act, intended to prevent this kind of substitution, frequently drove it underground rather than stopping it, because the ambiguity of the legal standard made enforcement inconsistent, and the incentive to find unscheduled substitutes remained strong. Prohibition did not eliminate 2C-B. What it did was move production from Shulgin's licensed laboratory into a distributed network of underground chemists, working from PICAL and related technical literature, operating in jurisdictions with varying enforcement regimes, and supplying a market that had developed both recreational and quasi-therapeutic interest in the compound. The quality and purity of underground-produced 2C-B varied enormously, which created exactly the kind of dosing uncertainty that the drug's steep dose-response curve made particularly dangerous. Pill testing services run by harm reduction organizations in Europe began documenting the gap between what substances were sold as and what they actually were. A gap that, in the case of compounds marketed as 2C-B, occasionally turned out to contain something else entirely. The underground chemistry scene that developed around 2C-B and the 2C family more broadly was, in certain respects, more sophisticated than popular representations of illicit drug manufacturing tend to suggest. PICAL is not a book that a casual reader with no chemistry background can simply follow step by step. Its synthesis procedures require training in organic chemistry, access to precursor chemicals that are themselves subject to regulatory controls, and laboratory equipment that is specific to synthetic chemistry. The people who were successfully producing 2C-B from PICAL were, in the main, people with genuine chemistry training, graduate students, laboratory technicians, pharmaceutical industry workers, operating outside their professional contexts and in violation of federal law, but not doing so incompetently. Quality control was a different matter. Professional pharmaceutical manufacturing involves multiple stages of testing: purity analysis, potency confirmation, contaminant screening, that underground producers were not equipped to perform reliably. A batch of underground 2C-B might be chemically correct but impurely synthesized, containing byproducts that were themselves pharmacologically active. It might be accurately labelled in terms of identity but incorrectly estimated in terms of potency. It might be something else entirely, a different 2C compound, a different phenethylamine family, or in the worst cases a substance with a significantly more dangerous profile sold under the name of a familiar one. Drug checking data from European harm reduction services documented this substitution problem with depressing regularity. A pill sold as 2C-B at a festival might test positive for 2C-B, or for a related analogue, or for a stimulant compound with a structurally unrelated profile, or occasionally for nothing identifiable at all. The experience of taking any of these was different. The experience of not knowing which one you had was constant. This is the specific harm that quality control exists to prevent, and its absence in the underground market was not a bug in the system. It was the predictable consequence of forcing production underground in the absence of legal alternatives. By the second decade of the 2000s, the broader landscape of psychedelic research had begun cautiously and incrementally to reopen. Studies of psilocybin at Johns Hopkins MDMA, assisted therapy at MAPS, and ketamine in clinical depression were producing results compelling enough to attract mainstream scientific attention and gradually regulatory interest. This renaissance did not initially include 2C-B. The compound remained Schedule 1, the research infrastructure for studying it was essentially non-existent, and the regulatory path for clinical trials with novel phenethylamine compounds was even more laborious than for the better-known classical psychedelics. But the renewed attention to psychedelic compounds as potential therapeutic tools created a context in which 2C-B's historical use in therapeutic settings became newly relevant. The researchers returning to psychedelic science in the 2000s and 2010s were, in many cases, aware of the informal therapeutic tradition around 2C-B, and several made deliberate efforts to document it before more of it was lost. Oral history projects, retrospective surveys of practitioners from the 1980s network, and archival research into unpublished treatment notes produced a fragmentary but suggestive picture of what had been practiced and what had been observed. The conditions treated, according to these accounts, included trauma, grief, anxiety, depression, and relationship difficulties, much the same range as the conditions being targeted by the MDMA and psilocybin research programs that were now generating headlines. What was missing, and what the informal tradition had never been able to provide, was controlled clinical data. The therapeutic accounts from the 80s were compelling narratives, not publishable evidence. They described outcomes, not mechanisms. They recorded observations, not measurements. Translating that tradition into a form that could survive peer review and regulatory scrutiny required exactly the kind of formal research infrastructure that the scheduling decision had eliminated, and that was only now slowly and incompletely being reconstructed. Spain, with a regulatory environment somewhat more permissive than the United States for studies involving scheduled compounds, became one of the few jurisdictions where preliminary 2C-B research could proceed. A small number of studies, modest in scale, carefully designed to minimize regulatory exposure, began providing the first controlled data on the compound's pharmacological profile, subjective effects, and safety parameters in human subjects. The results were, as the informal tradition had suggested they would be, interesting. Not definitive, not sufficient to support therapeutic claims, but interesting in the specific way that suggests a compound is worth investigating further. Whether 2C-B will eventually reach the kind of formal clinical standing that MDMA and psilocybin are currently pursuing is a question that remains genuinely open. The barriers are substantial, the regulatory pathway is long, the commercial investment required for clinical trials is significant, and the compound faces a reputational burden from its association with the rave scene that the more academically credentialed classical psychedelics have been able to avoid. But the interest is real, and the history is available. Whether the history will be used is still being written. Understanding what 2C-B does to the brain requires starting with serotonin, specifically with the 5-HT2A receptor, which is the primary target of classical psychedelics and which appears to mediate most of the perceptual and cognitive effects associated with that class of compound. Like LSD and psilocybin, 2C-B acts as an agonist at the 5-HT2A receptor, producing the characteristic visual distortions, altered thought patterns, and perceptual changes associated with psychedelic experience. But 2C-B also has a meaningful affinity for dopamine receptors and other serotonin receptor subtypes, which likely accounts for the additional empathogenic quality, the warmth, the social openness, the mood elevation that distinguishes it from the classical psychedelics and brings it closer to MDMA in certain experiential dimensions. The 5-HT2A receptor is expressed throughout the cortex, with particularly high density in the prefrontal cortex, the region associated with complex cognition, self-referential thinking, and the default mode network, which is the brain's baseline state of internally directed thought. Current models of psychedelic action propose that agonism at 5-HT2A disrupts the default mode network's normal patterns of activity, producing a state of increased neural plasticity, a loosening of the established patterns through which the brain typically processes sensory information and constructs the experience of self. This disruption is what produces both the perceptual changes and the altered sense of identity that characterize psychedelic experience. It is also, according to the leading hypothesis in psychedelic neuroscience, what makes the psychedelic state therapeutically interesting. A brain in a state of increased plasticity may be more capable of updating its established patterns, which is precisely what therapeutic change requires. The dopaminergic component of 2C-B's pharmacology is less well characterized, but it is likely relevant to the compound's motivational and affective qualities. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter most directly associated with reward, motivation, and social engagement, and 2C-B's effects on dopamine signaling may contribute to the specific quality of social warmth and heightened engagement with the environment that users consistently describe as distinct from the experience of classical psychedelics alone. This is the molecular basis for the frequent comparison to MDMA. Both compounds affect dopamine, and both produce a quality of elevated mood and social openness that the purely serotonergic psychedelics, psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, do not produce to the same degree. What is less clear is exactly how 2C-B's receptor binding profile translates into its specific experiential qualities. The relationship between pharmacology and subjective experience is one of the most important unsolved problems in neuroscience, and psychedelic compounds are among the most interesting tools available for studying it, precisely because they produce such pronounced and reliably describable changes in experience that can, in principle, be correlated with measurable changes in brain activity. The neuroimaging studies that have been conducted with psilocybin and LSD have produced significant insights into this question. Equivalent studies with 2C-B have not yet been done at scale, which means the pharmacological picture remains partial. An accurate description of how the compound interacts with its molecular targets, without a complete account of how those interactions produce the experience that human beings report. Among the most durable insights produced by decades of psychedelic research is the concept of set and setting. The idea that the experience produced by a psychedelic compound is determined not only by the pharmacology of the compound itself, but by the psychological state of the user and the physical and social environment in which the drug is taken. This principle, first articulated systematically by Timothy Leary in the 1960s and subsequently supported by a substantial body of research, applies with particular force to 2C-B. The compound's emotionally amplifying character, the way it appears to intensify and make transparent whatever psychological material is already present, means that unresolved anxiety, interpersonal tension, or an unfamiliar or threatening environment can transform what might otherwise be a pleasant experience into something considerably more difficult. The set is the internal component, your psychological state, your expectations, your history, your relationship to the emotional material that the compound tends to surface. 2C-B, like most psychedelics, does not create emotions so much as amplify them and make them temporarily unavoidable. If you bring anxiety into the experience will amplify that anxiety. If you bring grief, the grief will become available in ways it normally isn't. If you bring unresolved conflict with another person who is present with you, the conflict will become more vivid and more demanding of attention. This is not necessarily a bad thing. In the right context with the right support, this amplification can be exactly what therapeutic work requires. In the wrong context, it is simply overwhelming. The setting is the external component, the physical environment, the people present, the sounds, the level of stimulation, the degree to which the environment feels safe and predictable. 2C-B's visual amplification of sensory experience means that setting matters even more than it does for compounds with a primarily cognitive or emotional effect. A visually busy environment, flashing lights, crowds, unpredictable movement, provides the visual system with material that the compound can amplify in directions that are not always comfortable. A simple, calm, familiar environment provides a stable perceptual foundation from which the experience can unfold without the added variable of environmental chaos. The convergence of these two variables is what Shulgin and the therapeutic community consistently identified as the difference between a productive and a problematic session, and it is what the recreational context most consistently gets wrong, not because recreational users are ignorant of the principle, but because the settings in which recreational use most commonly occurs are precisely the ones least suited to the compound's properties. A festival is a setting characterized by crowds, unpredictable sensory stimulation, the absence of trusted therapeutic support, the presence of alcohol and other compounds in the environment, and the social pressure to maintain a particular kind of social presentation, rather than moving freely through whatever psychological material the compound surfaces. It is, in other words, almost a deliberate inversion of the conditions under which 2C-B works best. This is not an argument against recreational use. It's a description of the variable that explains a significant portion of the variance in recreational outcomes. The same compound, administered in controlled therapeutic conditions, produces a very different distribution of outcomes than the same compound administered in a festival setting, and the difference is set and setting, not pharmacology. The legal status of 2C-B varies considerably across jurisdictions, and the patchwork of international scheduling decisions that followed its initial synthesis reflects both the political complexity of international drug law and the practical limitations of a control regime built around named compounds. In the United States, Schedule I status has applied since 1995. In the United Kingdom, 2C-B was placed under the Misuse of Drugs Act in 2002. Germany, the Netherlands, and most European Union member states followed at various points through the early 2000s. However, the compound remained unscheduled in a number of jurisdictions for years after it was first synthesized, and international variation in scheduling continues to create both enforcement challenges and, for researchers, varying degrees of legal access. The international drug control system is built on a framework of United Nations conventions, primarily the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs and the 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances, that establish common scheduling frameworks to which member states are expected to conform. The 1971 Convention covers the broad class of psychotropic substances, and it was under this framework that classical psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, and mescaline were internationally scheduled in the early 1970s. Novel compounds like 2C-B, synthesized after the conventions were adopted, have had to be added through amendment processes that are slower and more cumbersome than national scheduling mechanisms, creating windows of legal variation that can persist for years. Portugal offers an interesting case study. Since 2001, Portugal has decriminalized personal possession of all drugs, not legalized but decriminalized, meaning that possession for personal use is treated as a public health matter rather than a criminal one. This does not change the legal status of 2C-B in Portugal. It remains a prohibited substance. What it changes is the enforcement response to possession of small amounts for personal use, which is diversion to treatment services rather than prosecution. The Portuguese experience, which has been extensively studied and is frequently cited as evidence for the public health benefits of decriminalization, created an environment in which harm reduction services could operate more openly, and in which drug checking services could function with less institutional risk than in fully criminalized environments, Switzerland, with its long tradition of pragmatic approaches to drug policy, has permitted limited research into psychedelic compounds, including phenethylamines, within controlled research settings. The handful of studies that have generated preliminary 2C-B data in human subjects have come primarily from Spain and Switzerland, jurisdictions where the regulatory environment was permissive enough to allow work that would have been extraordinarily difficult in the United States or United Kingdom. This is, it should be noted, not a consequence of these countries having more permissive drug laws in general. It is a consequence of having more flexible research authorization frameworks, a distinction that is bureaucratically important and practically significant. By the early 2000s, 2C-B had established a stable presence on the festival circuit in Europe and North America, not as dominant as MDMA, not as historically freighted as LSD, but consistently present as a secondary or occasional option for festival goers seeking something with a different character than the more common options. Its reputation in these settings was generally positive, but with important caveats attached. Shorter duration than LSD made it more festival compatible. The empathogenic quality was valued in social settings, but the dose sensitivity was widely noted and had produced enough difficult experiences to generate consistent warnings in harm reduction literature. Festival harm reduction organizations began deploying drug checking services at major events, using reagent testing kits that could identify 2C-B and distinguish it from other compounds. The festival circuit is a peculiar ecosystem in the pharmacological history of any compound, because it combines the worst possible conditions for responsible use with a subculture that has, over decades, developed its own informal norms and harm reduction practices in the absence of formal institutional support. The major festivals with established harm reduction presences, Glastonbury in the United Kingdom, Lightning in a Bottle and Burning Man in the United States, several of the larger European electronic music festivals, had by the early 2000s developed relatively sophisticated on-site services, medical tents staffed with volunteers trained in responding to psychedelic distress, drug-checking stations offering basic compound identification, and printed harm reduction literature specifically addressing the compounds most commonly present at each event. The data generated by these services, while informal and not published in peer-reviewed literature, constituted a real-time pharmacological surveillance system of a kind that official drug monitoring programs struggle to match for currency and specificity. The harm reduction services at major festivals knew what compounds were circulating at those events faster and in more detail than any official monitoring system, because they were testing the actual substances rather than waiting for analysis of seized materials to work through official channels. This information was shared within harm reduction networks and influenced the guidance distributed to festival attendees in ways that were practically useful, even if methodologically informal. The presence of drug-checking services at festivals also had an unexpected effect on demand for accurate information. People who brought substances to be tested and discovered that what they had was not what they thought they had were, according to accounts from dance-safe and European equivalents, frequently willing to modify their intended behaviour on the basis of that information. A person who had planned to take a pill sold as 2C-B and discovered it contained a different compound, or a different dose than expected, where quantitative testing was available, often decided to take less or nothing. This is a simple and unsurprising behavioural response to accurate information, and it is the basic mechanism by which harm reduction services reduce harm. Its effectiveness depends entirely on the information being accurate, which is why the quality of drug-checking services matters, and why investment in their capacity is a public health issue. Alexander Shulgin died in 2014 at the age of 88. in the house in Lafayette where he had spent his most productive decades. The farm, with its backyard laboratory and its extraordinary archive of chemical records, correspondence and unpublished manuscripts, became a significant question for those interested in preserving the scientific and cultural legacy of his work. His wife Anne, who had been his partner in both the chemical explorations and the writing of Piscal, and its companion volume Tiscal, which documented the tryptamine family, continued to live at the property after his death, and worked with researchers and archivists to document and preserve the archive. The archive itself was, by accounts of those who had access to it, extraordinary in both volume and specificity. Shulgin had kept notebooks throughout his career with the same meticulous attention he brought to everything, every synthesis documented, every trial recorded, every compound characterized to the extent of his ability to characterize it. These notebooks covered not only the 200-plus compounds documented in Piscal and Tikal, but a significant number that were never published, trials that were conducted and documented, but that Shulgin chose not to include in his public record, either because the compounds were uninteresting, because the results were too personal, or because he judged the information better held privately. The question of what to do with this archive was not a simple one. The notebooks contained detailed synthesis instructions for compounds, many of which were controlled substances under federal law. Their unrestricted publication would raise exactly the issues that Piscal had raised, in a legal environment that had not become more permissive since 1991. At the same time, preserving the archive as a closed collection accessible only to authorized researchers would create exactly the kind of institutional gatekeeping that Shulgin had spent his career opposing. The tension between these two imperatives, open information versus responsible management of sensitive material, was characteristically a tension that had no clean resolution. Preservation efforts proceeded on multiple tracks. Physical preservation of the laboratory was one priority. The equipment, the reference materials, the physical space in which the work had been done. Digitization of the notebooks was another, with questions about access and distribution handled on a case-by-case basis. The correspondence, letters to and from researchers, therapists, legal officials, journalists, and curious members of the public was also preserved, and constitutes a record of the intellectual and social networks through which Shulgin's ideas circulated over 50 years. Anne Shulgin, who died in 2022 at the age of 89, had continued to be involved in the psychedelic research community until near the end of her life, giving interviews, supporting harm reduction efforts, and maintaining the network of relationships that had been central to both her and her husband's work. She was, by all accounts, a figure of considerable personal authority in that community, and her presence helped ensure continuity of institutional memory through the transition from the underground era of the 80s and 90s into the more public and academically credentialed era of the late 2000s and beyond. The archive remains. The work of making it accessible continues. The scheduling of 2C-B in the 1990s effectively halted the formal scientific investigation of the compound for roughly 2 decades. What accumulated in that period was informal, self-reported, and methodologically inconsistent, valuable in aggregate but impossible to assess by the standards of clinical science. When researchers began returning to 2C-B in the context of the broader psychedelic research renaissance, they found a compound with an intriguing and well-documented informal profile, essentially no formal pharmacological characterization in human subjects, and a Schedule I classification that made even basic research extraordinarily difficult. The studies that have been conducted, primarily in Spain, where the regulatory environment has permitted limited research, have begun to provide the kind of controlled, measured data that the informal tradition lacked. The first formal human pharmacology study of 2C-B in decades was conducted by researchers at the Hospital de la Santa Creu i Sant Pau in Barcelona, published in 2021, in a field that had been waiting for exactly this kind of data for 30 years. The study was modest in scale, a controlled, double-blind crossover design in a relatively small number of healthy volunteers, but it was, by the standards of the available literature, a landmark. It provided the first systematically measured characterization of 2C-B's acute effects in a controlled clinical setting. Dose-response data, physiological parameters including heart rate and blood pressure, subjective experience ratings using validated scales, and a timeline of onset, peak, and offset that confirmed and quantified what the informal literature had described for decades. Think about what double-blind and crossover actually mean in this context. Crossover means every participant received both 2C-B and a placebo on different occasions in a randomized order, so that each person served as their own control. Double-blind means neither the participant nor the researcher assessing them knew which they had received at any given session. This sounds obvious. Of course you design it that way, until you stop and appreciate that designing it that way for a compound that produces pronounced and unmistakable perceptual alterations at active doses is genuinely challenging. Blinding participants to whether they have received a psychedelic or a sugar pill requires a level of pharmacological subtlety in the placebo condition and a degree of restraint in the dose selection that places real constraints on the questions you can ask. The Barcelona team navigated this with care, and the result was the first controlled data on 2C-B that could be placed in a published journal and survive peer review. The results were, as the informal tradition had predicted, consistent with 2C-B's reputation. At the doses tested, the compound produced significant alterations in perception and cognition, elevated mood, increased heart rate and blood pressure in the range, typical for compounds with sympathomimetic properties, and a subjective experience profile that combined psychedelic and empathogenic elements, in the way that users had consistently reported for 25 years. The study found no serious adverse events, confirming the favourable acute safety profile that harm reduction literature had documented. It also provided for the first time a formal measurement of the empathogenic component, using standardized scales designed to quantify feelings of emotional closeness, openness, and social connectedness, and found that 2C-B scored meaningfully on these measures, producing the combination of psychedelic and prosocial effects that had made it interesting to therapists in the 1980s and that distinguished it from the classical psychedelics in ways that user reports had long described but that the formal literature had never confirmed. The physiological findings were also informative. Blood pressure and heart rate elevations were present but moderate, significant enough to be clinically relevant as contraindications for people with cardiovascular conditions, but not of a magnitude that would represent a significant barrier to therapeutic use in healthy adults under medical supervision. Body temperature was monitored and remained within normal range, which is relevant given the combination risks discussed in earlier segments. The timeline of effects was consistent with informal reports. Onset within 45 minutes, peak at approximately 2 to 3 hours, return toward baseline by 5 to 6 hours, with no significant residual effects at 24 hours. What the Barcelona study did not do, could not do at its scale, was answer the therapeutic questions. It characterized the acute experience of 2C-B in healthy volunteers. It did not study its effects in people with depression, trauma, anxiety, or any of the other conditions that the informal therapeutic tradition had suggested it might address. This is a standard limitation of Phase 1 pharmacology research, which is the category this study most closely resembles. You establish safety and basic pharmacological parameters before you ask clinical questions. The clinical questions come later, in studies designed specifically to test efficacy in the relevant patient populations. Those studies, for 2C-B, have not yet been conducted. This is what science looks like when it has been delayed by 20 years. A modest study confirming what experienced users already knew, providing the numerical baseline that clinical development requires, and creating the published foundation on which larger and more ambitious studies can eventually be built. It is simultaneously a significant scientific event and an illustration of how much was lost during the scheduling moratorium, how much time, how many questions, how many potential insights were forfeited because the regulatory decision of 1995 foreclosed research that could have been happening all along. The researchers who conducted and published this study were aware of its historical context and explicit about its limitations. They positioned it carefully, not as proof of therapeutic benefit, not as a clinical recommendation, but as the restoration of a scientific baseline that should never have been lost. Here is what the compound does in a controlled setting. Here are the numbers. Here is the foundation. Now let us see whether anyone is permitted to build on it. The delay was real, and its cost was real. The research itself, late as it arrived, was a small and necessary act of restoration. The microdosing trend, the practice of taking subperceptual doses of psychedelic compounds, typically LSD or psilocybin, for purported cognitive and mood benefits, has generated considerable popular and scientific attention since approximately 2015. The question of whether 2C-B produces similar effects at subperceptual doses is one that has been asked in harm reduction communities and in formal research circles for years, and the answer is characteristically complicated. At doses below the threshold of full perceptual effect, roughly 5 to 8 milligrams, users report a mild mood lift, enhanced sensory acuity, and a kind of low-level warmth that some describe as useful for creative work and social engagement. Whether these effects constitute genuine cognitive enhancement or a mild hedonic boost with no lasting benefit is a question that has not been formally studied and is therefore impossible to answer with any rigour. Let's start with what subperceptual actually means for 2C-B, because the bar is different here than it is for compounds with gentler dose-response curves. For psilocybin, a subperceptual dose is typically defined as somewhere between 0.1 and 0.3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, a dose that produces no noticeable psychedelic effect, but that may have subtle influences on mood, cognitive flexibility, and neuroplasticity. For LSD, the equivalent range is typically between 5 and 20 micrograms. For 2C-B, the threshold of perceptual effect, the dose at which most people begin to notice something, is around 8 to 12 milligrams. Below that, in the 5 to 8 milligram range, you're in territory that users describe as subtly active but not perceptually disruptive. The effects are gentle enough to be deniable. You might feel slightly more socially at ease, slightly more sensorially present, slightly warmer in mood, or you might attribute the whole thing to a good night's sleep and a pleasant morning. This ambiguity is one of the defining features of microdosing as a practice, and it cuts in both directions. It makes microdosing plausibly useful if you can get a mood benefit without functional impairment that is genuinely appealing, and it makes it genuinely difficult to study. Placebo effects are powerful, and a subtle positive mood shift is exactly the kind of outcome that placebo effects are best at producing. The person who takes a sub-perceptual dose of 2C-B on a Tuesday morning expecting to feel slightly better may indeed feel slightly better, but whether the improvement came from the compound, from expectation, from the ritual of the dose, or from the simple psychological effect of having done something intentional for their well-being is almost impossible to determine without rigorous placebo-controlled design, which is, as noted, very hard to execute when the compound in question is distinguishable from placebo by its perceptual effects at only slightly higher doses. The informal microdosing literature on 2C-B has some distinctive features that differentiate it from the equivalent literature on LSD and psilocybin, where LSD and psilocybin microdosing protocols typically involve taking a dose every 3 to 4 days on a structured schedule. 2C-B microdosing reports tend to cluster around occasional, situational use rather than regular scheduled dosing. People describe taking it before social events, creative work sessions, demanding professional situations, or simply on mornings when they want to approach the day with more sensory richness than usual. This situational quality may reflect something real about the compound's specific pharmacology. The empathogenic component may be particularly suited to social and interpersonal contexts, or it may simply reflect the different subcultures in which each compound's microdosing traditions developed. What is specific to 2C-B, and relevant to this question above all others, is the dose-response curve issue that runs through every part of its story. The gradient between subperceptual and clearly perceptual is narrower for 2C-B than for most compounds with microdosing traditions, and this creates a practical challenge that compounds the theoretical one. You're not just managing the expectation effects that complicate any microdosing assessment. You're also managing a margin of error in dosing that is physically small. A 5 mg dose and a 12 mg dose look similar as powders. They produce categorically different experiences. Getting this wrong in the subperceptual range means overshooting into the perceptual range, which is at minimum disruptive to whatever Tuesday activity prompted you to microdose in the first place. The quality control problem that haunts 2C-B throughout its history is, in other words, even more acute in the microdosing context than in full session use. For a full session, the difference between 15 and 20 milligrams matters, but you are already prepared for an experience of some intensity. For microdosing, where the entire premise is invisibility of effect, the difference between 5 milligrams and 10 milligrams is the difference between subtle background warmth and a clearly altered afternoon. This is not hypothetical. It is a pattern documented in harm reduction reports and user forums, where accounts of intended microdoses that became unexpectedly active experiences are sufficiently common to have their own informal classification. None of this means 2C-B microdosing is without value or without a legitimate evidence base. It means the evidence base is informal. The practice requires unusually precise dosing infrastructure, and the specific questions it raises have not been formally studied. The same compound that produced some of the most vivid and transformative full psychedelic experiences documented in the informal literature is also, in its quietest form, a gentle mood lift that you might take before a meeting. The range between those two things is measured in milligrams, and all of it is happening in a regulatory environment that makes studying either end of that range extraordinarily difficult. That is a research gap that serves no one. Any psychedelic compound with a sufficiently wide recreational distribution accumulates a cultural footprint, references in music, descriptions in literature, accounts in memoir, influence on visual art, that forms a kind of unofficial documentary record of its presence in a given era. For 2C-B, this footprint is more diffuse than for LSD or MDMA, both of which were culturally prominent enough to generate substantial explicit documentation, but it is nonetheless real. The compound appears in a number of memoirs and accounts from the rave era, is referenced in harm reduction writing and psychedelic literature, and has influenced, at least by the account of practitioners, the work of artists and musicians working within the electronic music and contemporary art worlds of the 90s and 2000s. The specific character of 2C-B's influence on creative work the heightened colour perception, the synesthetic qualities, the emotional openness combined with cognitive clarity, has been described by artists as distinct from the influence of other psychedelics, producing a particular quality of saturated, emotionally resonant aesthetic experience that leaves traces in work made after the fact. Electronic music is the cultural domain most directly and consistently linked to 2C-B's primary recreational context, and the relationship between the compound's experiential properties and the aesthetic architecture of late 90s electronic music is worth examining in some specificity. The music most commonly associated with the rave and club contexts where 2C-B circulated, progressive trance, techno, deep house, and the slower, more melodically elaborate end of electronic dance music, shares structural properties that align in interesting ways with what users describe as the compound's auditory effects: complex layering of rhythmic and harmonic elements, gradual builds and releases of tension over long timescales, the use of repetition not as stasis but as a vehicle for transformation, the same 4-bar loop heard for the 20th time producing a different experience than it did on the first hearing. These are structural features that 2C-B's documented enhancement of pattern recognition, temporal processing, and auditory sensitivity might be expected to amplify in compelling directions. Whether this represents a genuine influence of the compound on the development of the music, a pharmacological shaping of an aesthetic, or simply a fortunate coincidence of aesthetic and pharmacological properties is impossible to determine with any rigour. What is clear is that the people making this music were in many cases the same people using the compounds at the events where it was played, and that the feedback loop between experience and creative production is not purely hypothetical. Producers describe experiences that changed how they heard sound. DJs describe performances shaped by heightened awareness of the crowd's collective state. Whether these experiences translated into the music in ways that listeners can perceive is a question that sits at the intersection of pharmacology, aesthetics, and neuroscience, and that no one has seriously attempted to study. Visual art influenced by psychedelic experience is a broader category with a much longer history, and 2C-B's contribution to it is harder to isolate than LSD's. LSD was the subject of explicit documentation by artists and writers from the 1960s onward. There is a substantial published tradition of artists discussing LSD's influence on their visual practice, and a corresponding tradition of art critics analysing that influence. 2C-B has no equivalent public tradition, partly because legal risks discouraged attribution, and partly because the compound emerged into a different cultural moment, one less oriented toward manifesto writing, and more oriented toward the night, the club, the private experience shared among people who are not, for the most part, in the business of announcing what had influenced them. What does exist, documented in interviews and in the personal accounts of artists who have become more forthcoming as the legal and cultural climate has shifted, is a consistent set of descriptions of how 2C-B influenced visual practice. The saturation and depth of colour perception that the compound produces at moderate doses, the quality of colours becoming more themselves, more vivid and present without being distorted, is described by painters and photographers as producing a heightened attention to colour relationships that persisted, in modified form, into sober work. The enhancement of texture and surface detail is described by sculptors and illustrators as changing how they perceived and worked with materials. The compound's tendency to make visible the structure and pattern in seemingly undifferentiated surfaces is described, most consistently, as an experience of seeing how things are made, a kind of X-ray vision for composition and craft that some artists describe as permanently influencing their perceptual habits. Literature and memoir occupy a different register. 2C-B has appeared in a range of published accounts of the rave era and the psychedelic underground, some cautiously, some explicitly, and in the emerging genre of psychedelic memoir that has grown alongside the therapeutic renaissance. These accounts share a quality of phenomenological precision that reflects the compound's reputation for producing an unusually clear and narratable experience. Altered, certainly, but not so far from ordinary consciousness that the experience resists description in the way that the strongest psychedelic states can. Writers who have written about 2C-B tend to write about it with a specificity that reflects this quality, not the oceanic, language-dissolving vocabulary of peak LSD or high-dose psilocybin, but something more grounded, more emotionally present, more attentive to the social and interpersonal texture of the experience. This cultural footprint, diffuse, legally constrained, emerging only partially into public record, is itself a kind of document. It tells you something about who used the compound, in what contexts, and what they made of it. It tells you something about the relationship between altered states and creative production that the formal literature has barely begun to examine. And it tells you something about the compound's character that all the pharmacology in the world cannot fully convey, that it has been for 50 years the kind of experience that people have wanted to write about, paint about, and make music about, even when writing about it honestly meant writing about something illegal. That is its own form of evidence. 50 years after Alexander Shulgin first synthesized it in his backyard laboratory, 2C-B occupies a peculiar and interesting position in the landscape of psychoactive compounds. It is scheduled in most major jurisdictions, continues to circulate in recreational markets at levels that drug-checking services consistently document, and sits at the edge of a formal research agenda that has not yet reached it, but is arguably moving in its direction. The broader psychedelic research renaissance has produced FDA breakthrough therapy designations for MDMA-assisted therapy and psilocybin-assisted therapy, mainstream clinical trials, and a regulatory environment that would have seemed implausible 20 years ago. Whether 2C-B will follow that path, whether the informal therapeutic record accumulated in the 1980s will eventually be revisited in formal clinical settings, whether the pharmacological profile that made it appealing to therapists then will make it appealing to researchers now remains genuinely open. What is not open is the question of whether Alexander Shulgin's creation has mattered. It has mattered to researchers, to therapists, to ravers, to regulators, and to the ongoing human argument about what consciousness is, what it can be, and whether the boundary between its ordinary and extraordinary states is something to be respected, studied, or simply, very carefully, crossed. The compound's position in the current moment is shaped by a specific tension. It has a stronger informal evidence base than many compounds currently being studied in formal clinical trials, and a weaker formal evidence base than almost any of them. The decades of quasi-therapeutic use, the systematic documentation in PICAL, the substantial body of user reports collected by harm reduction organizations across 30 years of recreational circulation, all of this constitutes a kind of preclinical record that is, in qualitative terms, more extensive than what existed for psilocybin when formal research on that compound recommenced in the early 2000s. But it exists in a form that clinical researchers cannot directly use. It is not structured as clinical data. It does not meet the methodological standards that regulatory bodies require for safety or efficacy claims. It is knowledge accumulated in the dark, and while it illuminates the territory, it cannot serve as the formal foundation for a clinical development program in the way that published Phase 2 trial data can. What would it take to close that gap? The short answer is money, time, and political will, expressed through a regulatory framework that permits the kind of work that has been done with MDMA and psilocybin to be extended to phenethylamine compounds, the money is slowly beginning to flow as the commercial success of MAPS and analogous organisations has demonstrated that clinical psychedelic research is fundable, that its results can be compelling enough to attract serious investment, and that the FDA is capable of engaging with the regulatory questions that this class of compounds raises. The time is the long constraint. Clinical development programs are measured in decades, even under favourable conditions, and 2C-B is starting from a position of essentially no Phase 2 data at a moment when its better studied relatives are approaching the finish line of regulatory approval. The regulatory framework is the variable most dependent on political context, on whether the momentum of the current psychedelic renaissance continues uninterrupted, or whether it encounters political resistance that narrows the window before 2C-B has had time to move through it. The comparison to MDMA and psilocybin is instructive, both for what it suggests and for its limits. MDMA-assisted therapy benefited enormously from the sustained, decades-long advocacy of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, an organisation that made MDMA its central focus, invested in systematic clinical research, and navigated the regulatory pathway with a patience and strategic clarity that produced results. Psilocybin benefited from the academic credibility of research programs at Johns Hopkins and NYU, which provided a reputational foundation that made funders and regulators more willing to engage. 2C-B has neither of these things yet. It has informal history, a single published human pharmacology study, and a reputation shaped primarily by the rave scene, a context that is not an asset in conversations with regulatory agencies, whatever its significance as a cultural phenomenon. And yet the compound's specific pharmacological profile, that distinctive combination of psychedelic and empathogenic effects, the manageable duration, the favourable acute safety record, the dose-response characteristics that make low-dose use plausibly therapeutic, is, in the context of the current research landscape, a set of properties that researchers actively want in a compound. The limitations of MDMA as a therapeutic tool, its cardiovascular effects, its neurotoxicity concerns at high doses, its pronounced physical side effects, have led researchers to look for compounds with a similar empathogenic quality and a more favourable safety profile. 2C-B's informal record suggests it might be such a compound. Confirming or disconfirming that suggestion is exactly the kind of question that formal research exists to answer. Shulgin himself, in his late writing and interviews, expressed cautious optimism about the direction of travel. He had lived long enough to see the field he'd worked in alone and underground become a legitimate area of academic and clinical inquiry. He had watched MDMA move from his introduction of it to Leo Zeff in 1977 to the front page of scientific journals in the 2010s. He believed that the compounds he had spent his career studying had genuine value that the scientific community would eventually recognise, and the trajectory of the field in his final years gave him evidence for that belief. He was also clear-eyed about what had been lost in the decades between his work and any mainstream recognition of it: the informal therapeutic tradition, the accumulated clinical wisdom of practitioners who could no longer document their work, the research that could have been done and was not. He did not frame this as personal grievance. He framed it, consistently and with the equanimity that characterised everything he said in public, as a straightforward observation about how history had proceeded and what it had cost. The molecule remains, the notebooks remain. The knowledge, partial, formally undocumented in much of its most important substance, remains in the memories of aging practitioners and in the oral histories that researchers are racing to collect before those memories are gone. And somewhere in a laboratory in Barcelona, in a funding application being reviewed in Zurich, in a graduate student's research proposal sitting in a department administrator's inbox. The next step in this compound scientific history is being considered. It may proceed, it may be delayed again. But the question that Shulgin was asking in his backyard in California in 1974, what is the relationship between this molecule and this mind, has not been answered. It has barely been formally asked, and the molecule, patient and chemically stable, and entirely indifferent to the regulatory history it has accumulated, is still waiting for someone to ask it properly. And so, here you are, lying in the dark somewhere between awake and not, having just travelled through 50 years of one molecule's extraordinary, complicated, legally contested, deeply human journey, from a backyard laboratory in the hills of California, to a South African sex shop, to a Barcelona hospital ward, to the edge of a scientific renaissance that may or may not arrive in time to do what was always possible. You started this evening not knowing the name Alexander Shulgin. You may be ending it with the strange, quiet feeling that you've been introduced to someone important. That feeling is correct. What the story of 2C-B really is, underneath all the chemistry and the scheduling decisions and the harm reduction literature and the nightclub anecdotes, is a story about curiosity, about one man's belief that the human mind was worth exploring with the same rigour and the same courage that science brought to everything else, about a window of therapeutic possibility that opened, produced something real and useful and largely undocumented, and then closed. Not because the work had been completed, but because the regulatory environment decided the work should not continue. About the people who kept the knowledge alive anyway, in handwritten notebooks and oral histories and error-weird experience reports and harm reduction pamphlets handed out at festival gates on cold European mornings. About the stubborn persistence of a question that no amount of scheduling has been able to make irrelevant. The people in this story were not simple. Shulgin was brilliant and perhaps naive about what publication would unleash. The therapists were visionary and operating outside institutional safeguards that existed for reasons. The ravers were seeking something genuine in conditions that were not built for safety. The regulators were responding to real concerns with blunt instruments. None of them were simply right or simply wrong. They were all trying to navigate a territory that the existing maps did not cover, and they all paid some version of a price for being early. What they leave behind is an incomplete record of a remarkable compound, and an invitation, if the current moment in psychedelic science continues to unfold, to complete it properly, to take the informal wisdom accumulated over decades and subject it to the rigorous testing that could confirm or correct it, to ask the clinical questions that the 1980s therapists were beginning to ask before the door closed, to find out, formally and definitively, whether what Shulgin thought he had found in his backyard was what he thought it was. Tonight, though, none of that is your problem. Your problem right now is simply to be still, to let the weight of the week settle somewhere it doesn't belong to you anymore, to notice that you're in a warm room, in a comfortable bed, with all of your basic needs met in ways that most of human history could not have taken for granted. That is not nothing. That is, by the standards of most of the people who ever lived, an extraordinary situation to be in. The molecule will outlast the debate about it. The question will outlast the regulatory framework currently surrounding it. Shulgin's notebooks will outlast the era that made them necessary. And you, tonight, will outlast this moment of wakefulness and drift into the one place that no scheduling authority has ever reached and no government agency has ever successfully regulated. The territory of sleep, and whatever waits in the dark behind your closed eyes, rest well, you've earned it.